Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War news update, first part thereof for the 22nd of January 2024. Let's get to where we normally start. Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply, and you can find them in the description to the video below. Some fairly high numbers for a number of these categories. 830 personnel lost is pretty significant. 11 tanks lost in a day is nothing to turn your nose up at. 23 armoured personnel vehicles is fairly hefty, and 21 artillery systems likewise. So I think above average in those two categories, and personnel, 830 personnel loss is pretty significant too. Anti-aircraft warfare systems is tough for the Russians, depends what value ones they are as to how bad that is, obviously, for the Russians. 29 vehicles and fuel tanks, again signifying that the Ukrainians are doing a fairly good job of degrading the Russian logistics capability, and 5 pieces of special equipment. That's a pretty good day for Russian losses. Of course, the question always is, what do the Ukrainian losses look like? And there are a number of places along the front line where they are under a lot of pressure. Whether that means they're losing men as opposed to losing territory is another question. Certainly in Krinky, where they're retaining their position on the left bank of the Dnipro River, the Ukrainians will be under a lot of pressure in terms of losing their personnel, and the difficulty they're finding in transporting injured personnel back across the river is a real challenge. But elsewhere, there are a number of places in south of Avdiivka, east of Avdiivka, north of Avdiivka, where things are pretty difficult for the Ukrainians, and they're struggling with a lack of artillery ammunition and general ammunition supplies. Are they losing troops, or are they just losing territory? That's a question. So anyway, talking about losses here from Andrew Perpetua's point of view, and I mean, he did say, interestingly, 28 Russian losses in one video. So that's vehicles, 28 vehicles lost in one video, and he shows here, some of them listed on the map. Just incredible, all in kind of one field. Of course, that's heavy work for him to break that stuff down and post it, but I don't know whether that's included on this list, which is, I mean, this list was out 4 hours ago, and he did say that, I think more longer. That was about 8 hours ago. So those 28 vehicles, are they all going to be on here? I don't know, but we'll see. Anyway, let's look at, I think they could be, because there's a lot of unknown cores here. So that could be vehicles in that field, and they all look to be tanks and IFVs. So it does look like a field where they've attacked. So that could be the case. Right, Ukrainian losses: boat, howitzer, a T-72, T-64s, a couple of them. So 4 tanks on there, howitzer. We've got a couple of APCs and a couple of trucks. So not hugely significant in terms of losses and the value of the losses. For the Russians, we don't have those air defense systems, so it'd be interesting to see what they are, whether they are those figures refer to the 2 tools that were lost yesterday. It's interesting. So even though I said there's parity in the number of stuff lost yesterday, the value was definitely in favor of the Ukrainians, because those air defense systems alone kind of compensated for the whole of the Ukrainian losses. So that's why I go through these losses to see, there's the numbers here. We can see that overwhelmingly the Russians have lost more. I mean, to the tune of 4-1, maybe even 5-1. Russian to Ukrainian losses. So this is the kind of loss that the Ukrainians would want to see, but it's about the value as well. And actually, there's some fairly high value stuff, as you can see that by the sheer amount of tanks. There are no. I mean, a lot of these tanks, it's just difficult to work out what they are. That seems to be the implication from Andrew Perpetua's list here. Although a few of them have been recognised. There is a T-90 tank that I've seen destroyed on the Kherson River area, but the Dnipro River area near Kherson. I don't know if that was included on lists previously, but that's one that came out yesterday. Anyway, excavators, some comms equipment, a whole load of tanks, and a whole bunch of infantry fighting vehicles as well of various types. And then your usual trucks and civilian vehicles too. So that's a really significant number of losses for the Russians, and then goes towards these fairly high figures we have seen. Well, if you include like this last week, some pretty high figures in these equipment categories that the Russians have lost. Well, we seem to be somewhat justified in believing that from these sorts of figures and geolocations. And of course, remember, you can always go back to Andrew Perpetua's original document to see, so it's linked in his tweets to see, the evidence of that. I'll just quickly remind you, all of these losses are sort of geolocated and they are listed. The original source material is listed to the side of his document. So, okay, moving on. In Bilohorivka here, we have a pretty significant explosion of an ammunition cache of supposedly, with a DPICM, so that's a cluster munition, a salvo taking out an ammunition storage at this location near Bilohorivka. Just south of the forest in the Serebryansky forest south of Kreminna. So just fairly significant. Now, I found this pretty interesting. So an anti-drone net has stopped Russian FPV loitering munition, which was trying to attack the positions of Ukrainian defenders. First of all, you can see that this is a drone with this is a pretty significant quadcopter with looks like a pretty decent explosive on board, size-wise, is attacking a trench. And this is what Andrew was saying a couple of weeks ago, that actually the Russians are using their drones to attack a lot more dugouts and trenches in a way that you would normally expect artillery to be used. Could that signify a lack of artillery ammunition? Could it also signify a lack of other targets for them to hit? So the Ukrainians aren't using that many vehicles and a piece of mechanized equipment in these sorts of areas, so necessarily the Russians have to use their drones against things like trenches and dugouts. But also, it has a significant impact on the Ukrainian ability to defend those places. But it's quite interesting here that A, you can see that, but B, that we've got a net that has done its job and protected those arguably who were in the trenches. I don't know if there was anyone there at the time, but the question for me is, how do you safely get that off the net now? I mean, I wouldn't want to go near it and start sort of crawling over a net to get this thing and pull it off, and then bang, it explodes, and it's like, yeah, not very clever. Anyway, moving on. So this, I won't play you this, but it's another interesting montage. There's a number of bits of footage on here, but this is another drone. So I don't know what it is. Well, it's an infantry fighting vehicle, I think, like firing off at Ukrainians, possibly in this tree line, possibly elsewhere, and it gets hit by an FPV drone, and man, it explodes. I mean, like, really explodes, and I'm trying to work out like how much of that is the explosives. Are the Ukrainians loading bigger explosives on these things, or is that just got a lucky strike that absolutely detonated the ammunition? Obviously, the ammunition side has cooked off here, but it's the ability of a drone to pierce that armor. There's talk about armor-piercing munitions now on drones that the Ukrainians are trying out, and is this an example of that? Because normally with these sorts of drones, you see them explode the back, and then there's a bit of fire, and eventually explosions like that take place after stuff has cooked off and it's got inside, and then bang. This happens instantaneously, and that's slightly different. You'd normally expect that to happen if it had been hit with, say, precision-guided munition, like some kind of artillery shell or some kind of round like that. But for a drone to do that, I think it shows that something else is possibly going on. So moving on. Now, this is doing the rounds of the mainstream media, and part of this frustrates me. So, okay, what's happened? Donetsk has been shelled. A shopping mall area has been shelled, and there have been dozens of people killed. And then this is all over the mainstream media. And you're thinking, right, okay, so the initial claim from the Russians is that the Ukrainians did this. And then the mainstream media catches onto that and says, oh, look at this. This is, terrible. And it's like, that happens every day in Ukraine. And like, you're not reporting that. As soon as that happens, the Ukrainians are supposedly responsible. It's all over the media. And that's a little bit frustrating. But that's not to excuse this if the Ukrainians have done it. But there's some weird stuff going on here. So there's a lot of pushback from Ukrainian sources. Now, all the caveats need to apply. Like, there's going to be an attempt to control the narrative here, and it could be the Ukrainians just saying, "Oh goodness, this is a big mistake. Right, we've got to sell it as a false flag operation by the Russians." Thing is, the Russians got formed for false flag operations, and there's some evidence to suggest that this is a false flag operation. So anyway, at least 25 people have been killed after Ukrainian forces shelled a busy suburban shopping area in the Russian-controlled city of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. Now, the first issue I have with this being a Ukrainian piece of targeting is the Ukrainians are running really low on shells, on artillery pieces of ammunition. So I don't understand why the Ukrainians would be flinging artillery into the middle of Donetsk from the Avdiivka direction, where they've got Russians attacking them in Avdiivka. They're going to think, right, rather than to hit these Russian troops that are storming the southern suburbs and dachas of Avdiivka, we're going to just turn that way and fling some of that artillery ammunition into Donetsk city and hit a shopping mall, because that's a good idea. Right, so one, I don't think the Ukrainians have got the ammunition to waste doing something like this. Two, they know that if stuff like this gets out, their PR gets hit. Right, this is not good. Three, it's not obviously not a good, operational, tactical, strategic, whatever, whichever level you want to look at this at, is not a good use of resources. It's not a good target. Like, what's the point of them shelling civilians in an area that they are strongly trying to persuade to be, under their democratic control? So none of this makes any sense. As I said, the Russians have formed, etc., etc. So, this is the Russians, the city's Russian-installed mayor, says this article, said Ukrainian artillery had fired on the Basan district where shops and markets are located. Denis Pushilin, the Russian-appointed head of Donetsk region, said emergency services were working at the scene. Blah, blah, blah. He said it had been hit by 155mm and 152mm caliber shells fired from the direction of Kurakove and Krasnohorivka to the west, so actually that's slightly south from Donetsk city, but those are areas that themselves under pressure through Marinka, through Novomykhailivka, right? So again, it's the same issue. Now, in defense of the Russian narrative, Reuters photographs and videos taken at the scene showed people crying, some of whom they said had lost relatives and bodies lying in the snow near one of the city's markets. So this is Reuters. At least some of these images are not faked, right? If that's the way you're going to go. This whole article is actually a Reuters, Associated Press, and Agence France Presse article, really, that the Guardian is just using or adding to. Now, P*11 here says the Russians used mortars to bomb the Donetsk market this morning, killing several people. So he's saying this is a Russian false flag. As usual, they're going to blame the Ukrainians for civilians. However, on the local chats, the population knows very well who is behind those atrocities. The population acknowledges that Ukrainian target oil storage and military infrastructure. They don't waste precious ammo on civilians. So the local chats from that area seem to indicate that this was a Russian thing. So I know I'm going to get pro-Kremlin trolls on the threads, shouting about this, no doubt. I just want to try and present both sides here, but I will conclude that I think it's more likely it's Russian, but that's not to say it definitely was. Euromaidan Press says 25 dead in occupied Donetsk shelling. Russia blames Ukraine, but is it true? Talking about self-proclaimed Donetsk leader Pushilin trying to press that narrative. The official Kiev has not yet commented on the shelling. However, a spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Service reported that Russians did this from their positions at the Chervonyvadsky mines in Makivka, a satellite city of Donetsk. And indeed, then there's other things coming out that look pretty dodgy. So I don't think any Oscars will be awarded for this production, says Spartan News. Now, Tim White says illegal occupiers now claim 25 people have died and another 20 have been injured in the shelling. This video was published 3 hours after the explosion, though it may have been shot earlier. But note how passers-by aren't concerned, and 2 of the 3 bodies are actually moving. And, you got someone walking by here just in front with a mobile phone. These people are supposedly dead, blown up from... There she is, just walking past her looking at a mobile phone. This is supposed to be, one presumes, giving an account of, everyone's just walking by, and there are these people that are supposedly dead and dying from blasts from Ukrainian artillery. So I don't know. It's all a bit of a mess, but I just think it's highly unlikely that the Ukrainians would be spending ammunition, flinging it randomly into cities, hoping to hit, I don't know, whatever, or either intentionally hitting a marketplace or being so inaccurate and I guess, free and easy with their artillery that they're just accidentally hitting marketplaces. So Tim White then says, they're now mourning today. Russia, which frequently targets civilians in Ukraine, blames Kiev for this, but there's no evidence, and history suggests a false flag. So make of it what you will. I'd be interested to see what your opinions are. The goods market is on fire in Samara. This area. The area of the fire so far is 800 square meters. The flames reach the pavilion with pyrotechnics. Later, there may be spectacular shots, so possibly some pyrotechnic stuff to go up. That's another big fire in Russia. Don't know what the cause of it is, but there you go. Right, on to strikes, distance munitions and whatnot, standoff munitions. Russia fired 8 drones into Ukraine overnight. All were successfully stopped by air defense. Again, question is, why so few? If they're all going to get shot down, what's the point of effectively wasting those 8, unless they are for other reasons? Maybe they're mapping the country out with cameras on board, so it's not a case of sending out these huge waves of saturation waves of Shaheeds to try and overcome air defenses and take out targets. It could be that they're just mapping the country, and so they're sending just a number and waiting for them to get taken down. I don't know, but it could also be that they don't have enough of these and they're sending up fewer than they would otherwise like. Explosions reported near Sevastopol shortly after the missile danger was announced. So the Ukrainians appear to be hitting areas. So still, locals report at least 3 explosions in the center of Sevastopol. And then more explosions recorded near the Balaclava district. Russian channels claim that a total of 4 Scalps or Storm Shadows were launched towards Crimea. All of them were allegedly shot down. You know what that probably means. There's no report. So, Sevastopol could have been hit with some significant munitions. We just don't know what the outcome is there. And going back to the strike on the Novatek oil facility in St. Petersburg, remember that happened previously. And it would, presumably one of the oil reservoirs is on fire here. As reported by Russian media, it was a drone attack. Ust-Luga is 860 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, so this was significant. Here is the location, just to let you know, very close to Estonia. What else? Besides that, there were drone attacks reported in other Russian cities that night, and we're going to come back to one of those on Smolensk in a second. So Russian media regarding the attack. So Novatek shut down its terminal at the Ust-Luga seaport after its attack. It was attacked by drones, and I reported that yesterday. So significant fires there. The fire was localized, but it was still burning the next day. Right, okay, so that's to remind you what happened. This is hugely significant. The Novatek plant, located on the coast of the Baltic Sea, stopped all technological operations after an attack by Ukrainian drones, according to Bloomberg. Shipment of oil to tankers was also completely stopped. This is massive. This is the second biggest oil terminal in Russia, right? So to stop export activity taking place from there is massive. Like, that will lose Russia income. These kinds of strikes from Ukraine are incredibly significant. Following the drone strike against the oil and gas terminals at Ust-Luga, all tanker loading operations have been suspended. Several fuel tankers are waiting near the Luga Bay. Ust-Luga is Russia's largest maritime terminal for crude oil exports, says Tendar. And here, Russia's Ust-Luga port handles just under half of all shipborne oil exports out of the Baltic. And the Baltic is Russia's biggest exit point for shipborne crude. The EU prioritised profits of Greek shipping oligarchs over Europe's security. Now Ukraine is going solo. So, okay, let's have a look at this very quickly. So Ust-Luga itself here, most of the export is done, as you can see by this blue, these blue parts of this histogram. is done by Greek ships. Historically, other Western ones, but less so now. So Greek ships are still major exporter of Russian oil. And then actually a growing grey here is unknown. So that's going to be, we don't know who owns them. Sort of these ghost fleets that are becoming pretty prevalent at the moment, and then some other non-Western ones there too. But interesting. I'd like to see. I mean, we're only 2/3 of the way through January, and I presume this is January's month, so that's incomplete at the moment. I'd love to see what January ends up looking like, especially given Ust-Luga being hit. So I think these kinds of strikes that we're starting to see are much more strategic, and they are falling in line with, I think, an increased capability of the Ukrainians to hit places at distance, joined together with a weakness of the Russian air defenses after they have arguably been brought down to the front line to defend the front line, leaving places like St. Petersburg and Moscow and other places around Russia more vulnerable to long-distance strikes from Ukraine. Okay, on to other bits and pieces. Russian soldiers begged Shoigu for vacation. So you've seen these plenty of times before, but there's a number of these that just started coming out again, and I don't know whether this is Ukraine trying to wrest back some of the narrative, given that they're finding it difficult on the front line. So it could be like, let's put out a bunch of these videos, or just genuinely like it is difficult for the Russians. I mean, it is definitely difficult for the Russians. It's just whether these are being strategically released or not. Anyway, these soldiers are begging Shoigu for a vacation, complaining about lack of winter uniforms and heaters. They say gasoline and food are in short supply. The occupiers from the 2nd Battalion, 6th Company, 26th Motorized Rifle Regiment, Military Unit 12267, recorded an appeal to the Minister of Defense specifying that in 7 months, the soldiers had not had a single vacation, while the number of dead and wounded was growing. And there's another one from Krinky, I believe, that has come out where they're just, lots of complaints, similar sort of stuff. So things are difficult. Of course, they are going to be difficult for both sides to some degree, right? Sevastopol is, so at the same time that Russia is being struck behind, well into their own territories in places like Ust-Luga and Smolensk. Where did I not get to Smolensk? All right, I've jumped the gun here. That's reminded me. I thought it was at the end. I wasn't. Right, yes. So going back to distance munitions. Sorry, brain fart. So Smolensk was hit as well at the same time Ust-Luga was hit, and that was an aircraft repair plant that was attacked. The plant was struck and it was engaged in the production and repair of weapons, aviation and military equipment. It also produces Kh-59 missiles. So this goes back to this kind of ability to have strategic effect on the Russians. These are really strategic targets that are being hit by the Ukrainians, as well as Makiivka being hit where there's heavy smoke, and that would possibly indicate oil being hit in Makiivka, which is Donetsk area. And in fact, there's more footage coming out there. Makiivka occupied Donetsk. A power station was hit. Parts of Makiivka and Donetsk itself are without electricity. So this is something that the Russians did to the Ukrainians in winter last year. Are the Ukrainians doing a similar thing back to the Russians? Media in Russia confirmed what I wrote last night. It says Tim White, Ukraine did hit the site which produces Pantsir air defense systems. So this is another place in Tula. So Smolensk was one place. Then Tula was hit. And this produces Pantsir air defense systems. Astra says 3 drones struck the Shelglovsky Val plant in Tula. 2 exploded in production workshops. Another caused their roof to collapse in an area not used. But that is really significant, given that one below here, news of daily afternoon downing of a single Kh-59 missile. Interesting, they're only using one yesterday. Well, we've got possibly a Kh-59 factory being hit with 3 explosions. And that, again, signifies that they are starting to really hit the Russians, hopefully, where it hurts. And then as far as, the Ukrainians, the only damage was in Dnipropetrovsk from the Russian Shaheeds that were flown into Ukraine, but they were all shot down. However, as I keep saying, what goes up must come down. So they do cause damage when they come down. Anyway, given all of those strategic strikes back into Russia, Russia is also suffering from energy and heat problems within their own country of the Russian Federation, but also actually in the occupied territories. So in Sevastopol, this is the 4th day without water. Okay, imagine your life, 4 days without water, how much you use water in your daily existence. So this is Sevastopol, which is the capital of Crimea, well, one of the main cities of Crimea. You've got Simferopol and Sevastopol. Without water for 4 days is a real problem, an island of stability in this complex political world, says P-Stel11. Okay, Ukraine is continuing to build its own Surovikin lines or trenches, putting a lot of thought. They're spending a lot of money building trenches. I talked about how this signifies that they are cognizant this war is going to become somewhat positional. This would indicate that they're probably not going to advance hugely forward, given that they're building defenses to defend where they are. Either they're expecting the Russians to attack and they need to up their defenses, or they recognize it's just going to be positional trench warfare. But nonetheless, these are those cylinders that I was talking about yesterday or the day before, that are kind of prefabricated units that they can drop into trenches and then fill around them, and they give much more comfortable environments to the soldiers. They're like command and control centers, bunks, and all that kind of stuff. And the metal is obviously gives them a little bit of safety as well. So they are building much more significant trench lines at the moment. Now, moving on to a bit of propaganda from the Russians. This is another case of listen to what the Russians are saying. Watch their TV. What are they saying? Because this indicates that what they're really intending. Meanwhile, in Russia, head of Russia Today, Margarita Simonyan, said that Russians don't mind casualties, don't want to live normal lives, are used to clawing things out of history by force, and know that it requires blood. Just not her own, right? She also says they want to create a new world order and will spill as much of their own blood as necessary to create a Russian world, a Ruski Mir. Just goodness me. In its place, a new, more just world order will be created. Just, really? Our Russian idea, our Russian world, and our own future life comes at the expense of blood. Just listen to what the Russians say. Make up your own mind about who the bad guys are. And it's simplistic, but it's true. Now, the Ukrainians have been on the receiving end of a massive cyber attack. The Ukrainians have themselves been hitting Russia recently. Well, now they're receiving some. This is Monobank, which is one of the main Ukrainian bank. It's their largest mobile-only bank, with waves of denial of service. That's DDoS attacks. These are the ones where you overwhelm the site with lots of bots, like essentially lots of online entities trying to get onto a website at the same time, such that the website can't cope and it crashes the website. It's a really common, quite low risk, I guess, but low. It's fairly easy to do in a sense. DDoS attacks are fairly widespread. Anyway, Monobank was taken down, which is obviously going to be difficult for Ukrainian economy. You hit these banking entities, and you end up not being able to spend money or receive money. Telegram has been so. A couple of points of this is what freedom looks like in Russia. Yay, liberty! Telegram has been disrupted in several Russian regions, with the most complaints, 28%, coming from Bashkortostan. I wonder what's happening there. Oh, they're having protests. Oh, now the Russian government has stopped them being able to communicate to stifle protests because, of course, they're not allowed to freely express themselves. Freedom of speech and all that. Yep, no, none of that, thanks. Local media also reported that WhatsApp has been down for nearly 3 days. This is what freedom looks like in Russia. And this is what freedom looks like in Russia. A bill on confiscation of property for spreading, scare quotes, fakes about the Russian army and, quote, calls for anti-state activity has been submitted to the Russian State Duma. In other words, how I would interpret this is, if you criticize the army, if you criticize anything about the government that is deemed as anti-state activity, if you want to do any form of protest, you can have your property confiscated. So you can lose your money and you can lose your house. So who's going to want to say things? Who's going to want to be critical of the Russian state, of Putin, of the army, of the war? You can't. Realistically, you can't. It's like, Hobson's choice or whatever. You're free to say whatever you like. But if you say it, I'm going to kill you. But you're free to say it, I will just kill you. So let's get this right. I have the freedom to criticize the government, but if I do, I'll die? Not really free, is it? There is no freedom in Russia, let's face it. Anyway, that's enough from me whittling on. Please like, subscribe and share. Really appreciate all your support. Take care and speak soon. Toodle pips.